Margaret had never been afraid of the forest. As a biologist, she had spent most of her life studying the natural world, mapping ecosystems, observing wildlife in their natural habitat. But this forest was different. It was old, much older than any forest she had encountered. It had an eerie stillness to it, a quietness that felt unnatural, as if the trees themselves were watching her every move. The wind barely stirred the leaves, and the birds had stopped singing. The task was simple enough. The local conservationists had noticed an unusual phenomenon. Large numbers of birds had been found dead on the forest floor, their bodies sprawled out in unnatural positions, as if something had struck them down all at once. The number of birds found was growing with each passing day. No one had been able to explain it. Margaret's job was to study the birds, to find out why they were dying, and to provide an answer, a theory that would explain the cause of death. But something about this place, about the unnatural silence, made her uneasy. She moved deeper into the forest, her boots crunching the dry leaves beneath her. The sun was fading, the light dimming through the thick canopy of trees. She had been walking for hours, collecting samples of the birds' feathers, examining the bodies of the fallen creatures. As she moved toward a clearing, something caught her eye, something dark, something out of place. At first, she thought it was a tree, a shadow cast by the dying light, but as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was a figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing just at the edge of the clearing. A man. No, not a man. His form was far too thin, too elongated. His arms stretched down to the ground, unnaturally long and ending in fingers that seemed to grasp at the air, as if reaching for something just beyond reach. His face, if you could call it that, was pale, featureless, devoid of any human expression. But what truly sent a chill down her spine was the presence that seemed to radiate from him. It was cold, suffocating, as though the very air around him had turned to ice. Margaret froze. She wanted to move, to run, but her legs felt like lead. She stared at the figure, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the stories, of course. The myths and legends about Slenderman, the tall, faceless figure that haunted the woods, whose mere presence was said to bring madness and death. But those were just stories. She didn't believe in legends. She was a scientist. She believed in evidence, in facts. But now, standing in the clearing, she wasn't so sure. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It simply stood there, watching, waiting. And in the silence of the forest, she could hear something else. A soft whispering, just beyond the edge of her hearing, like the rustling of dry leaves. The whispering seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her. It was as though the forest itself was alive, breathing, and whatever this creature was, it was the forest's keeper. Margaret's breath hitched as she took a step back. Her foot brushed against something cold, something that hadn't been there a moment ago. She looked down to find the dead body of a bird, its body contorted in an unnatural position, its eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, her eyes returned to the figure in the clearing. It was closer now, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, its presence filling the space with an overwhelming sense of dread. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the words were vibrating in her skull. "Leave now," it whispered. But it wasn't the wind. It was the voice of the creature, or something else. Something in the forest. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. She had to leave. She had to run. But before she could turn, before she could take a single step, the world around her went dark. The trees disappeared, the ground vanished. And the last thing she heard was the low, raspy whisper right next to her ear. "You are already too late." What happens when you realize the thing you fear is real, and it's been watching you the entire time? Margaret had never been one to believe in supernatural forces, but standing there in the darkening woods, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The air was thick with tension, and the forest, which had always felt so alive, now felt suffocating, oppressive, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for her to make a mistake. She had come here to study the birds, to uncover the reason behind their strange deaths. But she wasn't so sure anymore. Something about the place didn't feel right, and the closer she got to uncovering the truth, the more she felt like she was being drawn into something she couldn't understand. Something far older and darker than she had imagined. The figure, the one she had seen standing at the edge of the clearing, was no longer there. But its presence lingered in the air like a bad dream. Its shadow cast long and heavy across her thoughts. The whispers were louder now, not just in the wind, but in the very earth beneath her feet. They seemed to hum, just out of reach, like a song that was always on the tip of her tongue, but could never be fully remembered. Margaret pressed on, her flashlight flickering weakly in the growing dark, casting strange shadows that twisted and danced in the corners of her vision. She tried to focus, tried to remind herself of why she was here. But the farther she walked into the woods, the more the sense of unease grew. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the silence between the whispers felt thick enough to suffocate her. The dead birds, dozens of them, had been scattered throughout the forest, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways, their feathers ruffled and coated with a strange, sticky substance that Margaret hadn't been able to identify. She had collected samples, taken notes, but the longer she spent here, the more the unanswered questions piled up. Why were so many birds dying in this one area? What was causing this strange phenomenon? And why was the forest so quiet? She had walked for miles, and yet there was no sign of life. No animals, no rustling leaves, no birds singing in the trees. It was as though the forest itself had fallen silent, waiting for something. She stopped by a large, gnarled tree, its bark twisted and warped in unnatural patterns. She crouched down, examining the base of the tree, where the ground was disturbed, the earth broken up as if something had been buried there. There was a mark on the ground, a deep, jagged scar that seemed out of place. Margaret's fingers hovered over the mark, her skin prickling as she touched it. The ground felt cold, too cold, and the air around her seemed to drop another few degrees. Something was wrong. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly, Margaret felt it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. She stood up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Her flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, she thought she saw something in the distance. A shape, barely visible, moving between the trees. She spun around, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the thickening darkness of the forest. But it didn't feel empty, it felt alive. The trees seemed to watch her, their branches twisting like fingers, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as if it were breathing. Margaret took a step back, but her foot landed on something hard. A stone, small but sharp, that was buried in the ground. She bent down to pick it up, and as she did, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. The forest seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. And then, just as she was about to turn and leave, she heard it again. The voice. This time it wasn't a whisper, it was a voice clear and unmistakable, coming from the trees themselves. "Leave," the voice said, its tone low and cold. "Leave now, or you will never leave." Margaret froze, the stone still clenched in her hand. The voice wasn't just in her head, it was real. She could feel it, like a pressure on her chest, a warning that she could not ignore. She spun around, but the forest was silent again, the trees still, the only sound her own ragged breathing. She had to go. She had to leave. But as she turned to make her way back, the flashlight flickered once more, and in the reflection of its beam, she saw it, something moving in the distance, standing still in the shadows. Her heart raced as she raised the flashlight, but when the beam landed, there was nothing. Only trees, only darkness. "You should have listened," the voice whispered, fading in the distance. "What happens when the forest has its own voice, and it speaks only to those it chooses to hear? Do you dare stay and listen? Or will you walk away from the shadows that follow you?" Margaret's heart raced as she hurried through the forest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The trees around her, once comforting with their silent presence, now seemed oppressive, looming over her with their twisted, gnarled branches. Each step she took, the ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, as if the forest itself were pulling her deeper into its depths. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following her. But the forest was empty, silent, save for the wind that whispered through the leaves. Yet something was off. Something was wrong. She had been walking in circles, or so it seemed. No matter how far she ventured, every path led her back to the same place. The trees were always the same crooked trunks and tangled branches. The undergrowth was thick and tangled, but no matter how she pushed forward, the landscape never changed. Margaret swallowed hard, panic creeping in like a cold fog. She wasn't just lost, she was trapped. Her fingers trembled as she fumbled for her map, but when she pulled it out, she found it was useless. The forest didn't look like anything on the map. There were no landmarks, no distinguishing features to guide her. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing the sunlight with its dense canopy. She pulled out her phone, hoping for a signal, but the screen was blank, the network completely dead. Her heart skipped a beat. No signal, no way out. She was utterly alone. The realization hit her hard. She wasn't just lost, she was being kept here. The whispers, the voice she had heard earlier, they were real. They were part of this place, part of the forest itself. The forest was alive in ways she couldn't understand. She had been warned. She should have never entered. But now, it was too late. Panic rose in her chest and she began to walk faster, the sound of her footsteps growing louder in her ears. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing thicker, their shadows darker. The path, if there had been one, was gone. There were no signs of life, no animals, no birds, no rustling of the leaves. Only the silence, the suffocating heavy silence. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she pushed her way through the underbrush, her eyes darting nervously. She could feel it now. The presence, watching her. She wasn't alone. Something was in the woods with her. Something that had been waiting for her. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, and she stumbled, barely catching herself. Her hands brushed against the rough bark of a tree, and she looked up. There, in the distance, standing in the clearing between the trees, was the figure. The tall, dark figure she had seen before. Only this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward her. Margaret's heart stopped. She froze. Her eyes locked on the figure, but it didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. She could feel it, deep in her bones, a cold, suffocating sensation. Her feet wouldn't move. Her body wouldn't respond. The figure's pale, featureless face was turned toward her, but it wasn't looking at her. It was looking past her, as if waiting for something. Waiting for her to make a decision. And then, without warning, the forest seemed to shift again. The trees around her twisted, their branches contorting in unnatural ways, as if they were closing in, pushing her toward the figure. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the air became thick with something heavy, something dark. Her breath came faster, her mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. But there was no time. The figure was moving toward her, its long limbs stretching out, its body bending in ways that weren't human. She had to run. She had to get out of here. But no matter which way she turned, the path was the same. The trees, the shadows, the endless expanse of dark woods, they surrounded her, trapping her, leaving her with nowhere to go. The figure was closer now, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. Its long, bony fingers reached out, and Margaret took a step back. But the forest wouldn't let her. The trees had closed in, and now the figure was all that remained in the clearing. It was too late. There was no escape. And then, just as the figure reached out to touch her, a voice whispered, low and cold, right behind her ear, "You should have stayed away, Margaret." She turned around, but there was no one there, only the trees, only the endless dark, and the figure, standing there, waiting. What happens when the forest you try to escape is already inside your mind? Margaret's eyes widened as the figure in the clearing grew closer, its long, twisted form stepping toward her with slow, deliberate movements. She tried to move, but her body felt frozen, her legs heavy with a weight she couldn't explain. The forest around her felt like it was closing in, the trees bending and twisting in unnatural ways, as though they were reaching out to trap her. The air grew thick with the suffocating sense of something watching, something lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to make a move. The whispering was louder now, echoing in her mind, a constant, maddening hum that she couldn't escape. She looked around, desperate to find a way out, but the path was gone. The trees had closed in around her, and the figure was only a few feet away, its pale, featureless face now inches from hers. She could feel the coldness radiating from it, a chill that seeped into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight, as if the very air had been sucked out of her lungs. And then, in that suffocating silence, she heard something that broke through the madness, something that gave her a fleeting moment of hope. A voice, a familiar voice, calling her name. "Margaret!" The voice was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second, calling to her from somewhere deep in the woods. It was Sarah, her colleague, her friend, the one who had stayed behind in the camp to keep watch. Sarah had noticed Margaret's absence, had grown concerned when she hadn't returned. The relief that washed over Margaret was overwhelming. It was her chance to escape this nightmare. She didn't know how Sarah had found her, but she didn't care. She had to answer. She had to let Sarah know where she was. She took a step toward the voice, pushing through the branches and thick underbrush, but the forest fought back. The trees seemed to shift and move, blocking her way, guiding her back toward the figure in the clearing. The whispering grew louder again, more insistent. "You can't leave," it hissed. "You belong to me now." But Margaret was determined. She could hear Sarah's voice clearer now, and that was enough to push her forward. She ran, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground, the branches scraping against her skin. The thorns digging into her arms. Every step she took felt like a battle, but the further she went, the clearer Sarah's voice became. "Margaret! Where are you?" Sarah's voice was frantic now, her concern cutting through the oppressive air like a blade. Margaret pushed forward, her heart racing in her chest. The forest tried to drag her back, but she couldn't stop. She had to find Sarah. She had to get out. "I'm here!" Margaret shouted, her voice hoarse and desperate, but the only response was the howling wind that swept through the trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the trees groaned and creaked as though they were alive, stretching their branches toward her, pulling her back into the dark heart of the woods. But Margaret didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She heard Sarah's voice again, closer this time. "Margaret, I'm coming!" The voice was full of relief, but there was a note of fear in it too. The forest had claimed Margaret for so long that Sarah's voice felt like a beacon in the dark. Margaret pushed through one last thick patch of underbrush, and there, ahead of her, in the clearing, she saw Sarah. Her friend was standing there, her eyes wide with concern and confusion. But the moment she saw Margaret, a wave of relief washed over her face. "Margaret, thank God!" Sarah ran toward her, and Margaret collapsed into her arms, the weight of the nightmare lifting just for a moment. They stood there for a long time, breathing in the cold, damp air. But then, Margaret heard it again. The whispering. It was faint, but it was there, and it came from the trees around them. The trees, the shadows. They were all watching, waiting. Margaret pulled away from Sarah, her eyes scanning the dark woods. "We have to leave," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We're not alone." Sarah looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the path. "We need to get out of here, now." As they ran back toward the camp, the trees seemed to open up, the forest finally allowing them to escape. But Margaret knew, deep in her heart, that this wasn't over. The forest had let them go, but it was always watching. It would always be waiting. She wasn't free, not yet. The house, the figure, the whispers, they would come for her again. They always did. What happens when you escape the darkness? But the darkness never leaves you. If you've been caught by the shadows, leave a like and subscribe to know what happens next. Don't let them win.